Thanks very much, Claire. Good morning, everybody, and I'm pleased to see so many of you here today wanting to learn how to, or brush up on how to write your own units of competency. And just saying that, as we always do at the start of this webinar, I just check that everyone knows the webinar is not about becoming an RTO. It's about writing our own units and having them accredited, because training packages don't have the units needed by our industry or our community. So just to set the record straight, because occasionally we have people who actually think that this webinar is about is to do with registering as an RTO. So first up, a check that you have received all of the documents that you need for today. We sent you pre-session reading, and the reason for that was that we used to do a 4-hour session, but to cut it back to the 3 hours, we've actually sent you pre-reading to do. That means that we can start right at the point of developing our units of competency and not have to go through all of the things that you must do in terms of consultation and so on before you commence work on your units of competency. We've also included a 10-minute break at the halfway mark, roughly the halfway mark, depending on where we are in the slides. It will be joined on to the time for an activity, but it will give you time, we're calling it a comfort break, but it'll give you time to go and make a cup of tea, or seeing you're not the one speaking, you might even be able to have your lunch while you continue to listen. Also, recently, new standards relating to the VET accredited courses were gazetted by the WA Parliament. This is to align with changes at the national level, and this workshop, of course, is based on the new standards. But having said that, the new standards haven't actually impacted the way we develop our units of competency, as TAC moved to the streamlined template some time ago to mirror what was happening in training packages. So you'll find that the templates that we're using today are the ones we've always used. You might also find that in the unit of competency template, which has lots of guidance in it, that there are nuances that have gone in there to make sure that we actually address everything in the new standards. But overall, everything's the same as it was. The purpose of our workshop today is to scrutinise all sections of the unit of competency template and consider examples for each. As it's a webinar and not a workshop, this means that we're providing you with examples of good practice and things to avoid in the form of activities, which we've called our 2 handouts. So you should also have a copy of the PowerPoint and notes pages, so if you want to make notes, you can. The unit of competency template, and of course those 2 handouts, handout 1 and handout 2, is how we've actually referred to them. So if we commence by just looking at what the components of a unit of competency are, this is just a list because we're going to go through each of these in detail. It's important that we write our units of competency in a standard format, and they will contain a number of essential components. This promotes national consistency. It helps us to ensure that units from a range of training packages and accredited courses can be easily understood and used by various users. And it also enhances recognition and transferability and portability of qualifications. As you probably know, if you use training packages, when it allows you to choose free electives from other training packages, it also allows you to choose electives from accredited courses. So if you're writing your own course with your own units of competency, and you also are an RTO with other things on scope, you are able to import some of your accredited units into some of those training packages that allow that free selection from elsewhere. The components of the unit of competency are set out in the template. We've got blue text under each heading indicating whether it's mandatory or not, and on the screen you can see that the couple of optional components there, prerequisite units and the range of conditions, and everything else on the list, of course, is mandatory. But as you're developing units, keep in mind that if you decide you are going to use one of those optional fields, once you use it, everything in that field becomes mandatory for RTOs. They must then do everything that you've said in that particular field. So the second part of the unit of competency is, of course, the assessment requirements section. And you'll notice that on training.gov, in training packages, it's a separate document. There's a separate unit document and there's a separate assessment requirements section. But when we write our units of competency for accredited courses, we have them all in a single template. So it just runs on from the end of the unit of competency into the assessment requirements part. So that's the part that has the performance evidence, knowledge evidence and assessment conditions. The actual template's based on the template for the standards for training packages, so it'll end up looking exactly the same. And the new format, of course, or this format, because we've always used it, reflects the template that's actually in the new standards for accredited courses, which is called the AQTF 2021 standards for accredited courses in WA. That's what was gazetted here. The standards in it are exactly the same as the standards that are in the National Vet Regulator Act, which is ASQA. So there's no change at all to the standards. It's just that for WA and for the VRQA in Victoria, ours are still called AQTF, but the 2021 on it tells you that's the latest standards which are identical to the ASQA standards. There are instructions within the template that you must follow. The accreditation process evaluates the documents you submit on whether you meet those requirements in the template. So some of it will be guidance and examples, but when it says that you must do something, you will be judged against whether or not you have actually done that. So let's start at the very beginning by looking at the codes. In WA, you are required to make up your own codes for your units of competency. You have to assign a unique 9-digit alphanumeric code, as it says on the slide. The first 3 letters must not duplicate training package codes. You have to be careful of that, so you check on training.gov that you haven't done that. It's the course identifier for you. You really have a lot of choice in what you do, but you can't duplicate anything that's already on training.gov. So make sure once you've thought up what you're going to actually call it, that you actually check that you're not duplicating it. We also are restricting this to 9 digits. Some training package codes you'll see are longer than that, but codes never exceed 12. Also, there are no spaces between the characters in the code. Another important thing to remember is, especially if you're someone who is going to reaccredit your course, that we don't use version identifiers anymore. So there's no A, B, C's and D's, etc. on the end of a unit of competency at all. If you look there on the screen, you'll see that the second group of letters represents the content in your unit, or it could be a field. If you've got a number of units that are all addressing the same sort of area, you might use a code that represents that. Otherwise, you'll make up a code that represents what's in the unit. And then, of course, you've got your 3 digits at the end. And most people use 001, 002, and so on. But you'll notice there is an example there that above the 007, which has 607, and that's because you are also allowed, as you're inventing new units, you can use a code that represents what the qualification is. Important also, I suppose, to remember that course owners do not identify the code for the qualification. So you're only doing the codes for your individual units of competency. The qualification code for an accredited course is assigned by TAC when the course is successfully accredited. So if you have handout 1 ready, task 1, which is the first one that we're going to do, is actually on the codes. So if you look on handout 1, you will see that there's one about developing workplace safety plan, there's one about manually handling goats, and there's one about customs and protocols being researched, and there's one about project integration. And what I've done is, in the brackets, I've actually said where it's from. So you'll see that the first unit that you're looking at is from a diploma of safe work practice. And what I want you to do is just look at the code, highlight anything that you think is untoward, might not comply with the things we've just said, and then I'll go through them with you. And we just take like 2 minutes to do this, because there's not a lot of thinking. You just look at each one, either highlight it, underline it, put a circle around it. You don't have to correct it. I will go through it with you in 2 minutes' time. And we're back. So you can see on the screen that I've highlighted some things in red for you. In the first one, there are too many letters there, and there's a version identifier at the end. So instead of using 3 at the beginning, this particular person has used the letters from D for diploma, S for safe, W for work, and P for practice. So they put them all in. And you could argue that you don't need the D in there. You could have just put SWP. A lot of people do use the D for diploma for their own purposes, because they write a number of courses, and in that case they use the D, but then they've only got 2 letters then to represent what the qualification is. And then the PLA is a planning unit, and in the 501 they've actually used the 5 to show it is a diploma for them, and of course it shouldn't have the A. In the second one, the CIV, of course, is our well-known abbreviation for Cert 4, but that's not appropriate here. It doesn't meet the template requirements. It's using Roman numerals, although the person who did this said to me it just says CIV, but I said, no, you can't fool me. That is actually Roman numerals. So their choice could have been to put CGB if they wanted to actually say it was a certificate, or simply GBC to represent goat breeding and care. And then they've got the MAN for the manual handling part, and then 002 is the second one in a sequence. The third one actually does meet the template requirements. So it uses OSM, which is offshore marketing, to represent their qualification. Then they used MRC for the, RCP for the next bit, which is research, customs and protocols. And if you've only got a few words in the name of your unit, it's quite easy to actually use some of those words to come up with a code. And then 403. So again, they've used the 4 to represent the fact that it is a certificate 4 that they're inventing, and all of those units will be new units in a certificate 4, so they can use that code if they want to. And you'll find that training packages are a mix of these. A lot of them just use the 001, 002 and so on, but some of them, like business services and ICT, property services, they all still actually put the code to show you that it was in the first time it was accredited for us, it's in a particular level of qualification. Now the last one's an interesting one, because this particular owner, and it was a real owner, and they weren't called ABC, they had a real code as their name, but it was a trademark for them, and so they wanted to use it in their units of competency. And even though we haven't actually listed this as something that you can do, it was accepted because it was unique. There was no one else with that particular code, and the rest of it, of course, was fine. The whole qualification was basically on project integration, so all of their units of competency were PRO. And then they just used the sequence identifier to differentiate them. And of course, all of them, as well as having a code, have a title anyway. Right, so on to part 2, which is of course the unit titles. I don't read from the slides, so if I gloss over things, it's because I expect you to read those there, and then I don't bother going over them. Except in looking at the middle section where it talks about commencing with a verb. After that, it talks about writing in sentence case where only the first letter is a capital letter, The second one, don't use title case where you have every main word capitalised, and certainly don't do all caps. So I'm just highlighting that because I'm getting a few where people are actually writing in title case and then they're importing units of competency from training packages and changing all of them to title case as well. So you'll note on training.gov, everything's in sentence case, and that's what we're replicating here in our titles. The unit title that you make up must represent a work outcome or, of course, the outcome of a work function. It's not a task, a single task, or a process. You need to avoid justification or purpose statements in the name. And as we're going through this, you'll realise that on training.gov there are lots of units of competency who do all these wrong things that we don't allow you to do for accreditation, because we're the gold standard, of course, and we want consistency. So avoid acronyms wherever you can, and certainly don't make up a new acronym. You'll find that there are acronyms around like WHS, which are perfectly acceptable, but try to avoid them if you can. It's only when it's a very wordy thing that you want to use that really an acronym is appropriate. Don't use ampersands, dashes, slashes, colons, semicolons, or full stops, which comes under our little heading up the top about don't use punctuation. Avoid terms that are open to interpretation. So don't add things like appropriately or relevant or effectively. Just concise and clean. When you write the unit of competency, the content of it will show what is effective or appropriate or relevant, and we make sure that we do that within the actual unit of competency. Also avoid terms that are not directly accessible. So we're not going to start our units of competency with understand or recognise or consider or words like that, because they happen inside someone's head. And you'll see if you've had a look at the unit of competency template, that our elements and so on have to be demonstrable. So you've got to be able to see someone demonstrate it, and you can't watch someone understand something. It's not directly accessible, it's assessed by other means. So we avoid those. So let's have a look at task 2, which now is giving you a set of titles. And those, the titles, we've only got 5 of them, so you probably only need the 2 minutes again to look through them. Driving a vehicle should be the first one. The next one is our goats again, manual handling. Address client needs, explore and effectively apply the New Testament, and manage financial resources. So just go through those, and we'll be back in maybe a minute and a half, because I don't think you need all that much time. And we're back, and I'll put the answers up here. And again, I've highlighted in red the things that I want to talk about. In the first one, vehicle is probably too broad to be useful when you're writing units of competency, because you can't tell whether the unit is going to apply to just a 4-cylinder sedan or a haul truck or a road train. And so it's better to actually describe it more clearly than that, or if it does apply to, say, a range of heavy vehicles, you would say drive a heavy vehicle, because that has a particular meaning for people in the industry anyway. To ensure safe operation is a purpose statement. It confines the outcome of the unit of competency to only safety, which of course it would not be correct. So it's an aspect of driving, of course it is, but you drive a vehicle for other purposes, not just to ensure safe operation. So you leave it out of here, and in the next section in the unit of competency, you will explain in greater detail what the context is going to be. In our goat handling one, which is the second one there, you can see they've used the word appropriate, and that's a term that's open to interpretation. Different assessors will use that differently. So we try to avoid that, and we certainly don't put it into the title of a unit of competency. And again, to avoid injury, there's another purpose statement. You manually handle goats for lots of reasons, usually to get them from A to B. And so avoiding injury, again, would constrain your unit of competency to only that particular context. So we don't want that. The next one would have been a good unit title, address client needs, straightforward, concise. Unfortunately, it's in title case. So those two letters that are in red should have been lowercase. So it was straightforward, address client needs. In number 4, explore I've highlighted because that's a process rather than an outcome. Effectively, again, open to interpretation by different assessors, so we don't use it in the title. And New Testament is way too broad, so we would want that to be constrained to what was actually in the unit, because the unit is not going to cover the entire New Testament. So, you know, something like applying the teachings of the New Testament Gospels, well, that would constrain it a little. And then the teaching, if you were applying the teachings to contemporary contexts, for example, so you're taking something from the Bible and applying it in a modern day situation, then you've actually given a lot of information, but you've constrained it so that it's actually more manageable. And of course, the last one, manage financial resources, is one that actually meets the template. The next section in our unit of competency is the application section. And in the olden days, we used to have a description of our unit of competency, and then we added an application section to show how it was applied in industry, and then we rolled them back together, and it's called an application section, but it still does have an opportunity to provide a description of the unit. So the instructions there briefly describe how it's applied. And the important thing about that first dot point is that it's by graduates. So we don't write this section as if it was curriculum and going to be taught to people. Even for knowledge-based units, the focus is on the application of the unit by those who have achieved it, not on people who are entering to learn and be trained on what it happens to be about. Don't use words like the unit applies to students who need to develop their skills, because then you're focusing on it as if it's a teaching tool, and it's not. It's meant to be a description of the outcomes that the student will achieve at the end of the training. So it's not going to talk about training at all. It's going to, the whole unit is going to be about the outcomes that the graduate will achieve. If you look at the last 2 points on the slide there, and I'll do it with the goat handling unit. So it would start, this unit describes the performance outcomes, skills and knowledge to handle goats in an urban environment using animal-specific manual handling techniques. And even that might be a little bit broad. It might be goat-specific manual handling techniques, because I understand handling goats is a particular skill. Then you would put a summary of the elements that were actually in the unit. And then you would say the unit is applied by, and you talk about who it's applied by. So it's applied by goat handlers when transporting goats for breeding or veterinary services in urban areas. So this particular unit is only about goat handling in urban areas. It's actually not about catching wild goats and trying to deal with them. So let's see how you go with a task on the application. So this is task 3 in handout 1. And again, we're just asking you to read through, and we've only got 4 this time, and see if you can pick out ones that don't meet what we've talked about already. So there's one about green economics. The second one is about licensed electricians. The next one is about people who are being trained in self-diagnosis. And the last one, the 4th one, is about a unit for designers and engineers. So you probably only need a minute for this one. So I'll be back in 1 minute. Right, so in reading through these, you should have come up with the fact that 2 of them were actually okay. So in the first one, this unit introduces the concept of It's talking about it as if it's the content of a subject area or a curriculum teaching area, rather than how the learning will be applied once someone has actually completed the unit. In the second one, the unit is applied by licensed electricians working in hazardous areas who do whatever. That's fine. It's actually, it's using the right speech, if you like, because it's about people who are actually applying the unit. The third one is, again, it's written from the learner point of view rather than from the point of a graduate. So this unit applies to people who are being trained, rather than this unit is applied by people once they've actually completed the training in the art of self-diagnosis. And the fourth one, the unit is applied by designers and engineers who work one-on-one with clients to develop workable solutions for whatever the unit happens to be about, is perfectly fine. The next part of our template is the prerequisites field. This is an optional field, and the instructions in the template tell you to delete this row if there are no prerequisites, but some developers prefer to actually keep the field in and say no prerequisites or nil. The people who do that tend to have units of competency that do have prerequisites. So in their qualification, there'll be some with prerequisites and some without. And so they want to make it clear that for some of them there aren't any, and then for the others they list what the prerequisites are. So that's perfectly okay to do that, even though it tells you to delete it. You don't leave it blank, of course. Some people just put not applicable, some people put nil, some people write a sentence and say there are no prerequisites. If you are putting prerequisites, all you have to do is put the code and title of the actual prerequisites. If you do put them in, we try to avoid prerequisites because they are a barrier to entry, and it affects the flexibility of your delivery, so that if you have a prerequisite, you're automatically saying the sequence is affected, because you must actually assess the prerequisite before you assess the main unit, so you can't just deliver them in any order. If you do include prerequisites, you must include them in the course structure so they can be completed as part of the course. So you don't put in prerequisites and then don't include them in your course structure, because that makes it very difficult for RTOs and for students to actually meet the prerequisite. If someone already has it because it's an imported unit from a training package, then that's fine. You just give them credit for that, and they just show that they've already got it. If you find that there's one aspect of a previous unit that is essential, it may be better to just include that aspect in your unit rather than making it a prerequisite. Important though, you can't make an entire qualification a prerequisite, because by definition, prerequisites are units of competency. They're units that must be actually assessed prior to the unit that they're related to. So you can't make an entire qualification a prerequisite. You can, of course, make it an entry requirement to the course. So that's how you actually put it in. If you think someone has to do one qualification before they do the next qualification, you make it an entry requirement to the second qualification. You don't list the entire qualification as a prerequisite. Some people still like to have co-requisites, which of course are units that must be delivered and assessed together, but they do not go in this field. If you are going to suggest that there are co-requisites, you would put them in the conditions of assessment in the second part of the unit of competency. You wouldn't actually list them here. So you can't put in extra fields. Some people like to put in an extra row and put co-requisites, and they're straight away non-compliant. That has to go back to them, and they have to actually move them. So don't do it in the first place, and you'll be able to get things right immediately. So we haven't got anything on handout activity to do. So we go on to the next field in our template, which of course are our elements. So the definitions are up there, and those definitions are actually in the guidance notes in the template. Remember, you are focusing though on work, you're not focusing on learning outcomes. And these are always in active voice, so they always start with a verb. And they must be related to the unit. You can't just throw in something that has no relationship whatsoever. Try to have a coherent, logical structure. Putting some things in the order that you do them in the workplace is a very good idea, rather than mixing things up. Sometimes people have their trainer's hat on when they write these, and they think, oh, it'd be good if they knew that first, so they'll write it up front. In fact, it doesn't happen until later on in the sequence of elements. So better to actually have a logical structure that reflects what actually happens in the workplace. And then, as we know, you then, as an RTO, in training this, you unpack it and work out the best way to actually train and assess it. Don't put in any optional or alternative requirements. Don't put in as needed. I notice there's a lot of these in training on training.gov, but if someone does it in the workplace as needed, in a unit of competency, they've got to learn how to do it so that eventually in the workplace, when it's needed, they will be able to do it. It's not optional for you to not train them in it, because they're going to need it when it's needed in the workplace, if you like. Don't put in very specific requirements, such as a particular brand of equipment or commercial software. You know, people write Excel, they should be writing spreadsheets, because we want our units to have some longevity. We don't want to have to change them every 2 minutes. And as we know, software and IT stuff changes almost daily, we think. Don't put any purpose or context requirements in the name of the element. It's very much the same rule as for the unit of competency itself, because it is just a part of the unit of competency. If you want context and purpose, you put them into the performance criteria, or they might already have been listed in the application section. Avoid personal pronouns, so don't use you and your, usually they're redundant anyway and you can leave them out, or sometimes you just have to replace them. And again, imprecise requirements or things that are not directly accessible. So apply knowledge of is one that's people's favourite to put in, but that's not directly accessible. You have to see whether someone is applying their knowledge of something, you've got to get them to do something else. It's the something else that should be the element, not an imprecise requirement that you can't actually directly assess. So in our next handout, which is task 4, it's still in handout 1, we want you to look at the elements in the 6 units of competency. The 6 units are about, the first one's basic geometry, the next one's about archiving and deleting documents, the next one's about building a business, next one is about leading a group discussion, the 5th one is about principles of aeronautics, and the last one is a SWOT analysis. So take a couple of minutes and again just highlight or circle or anything you've got a question about that we will cover when we come back in 2 minutes. Okay, we're back. And again, I've highlighted in red the things that I want to talk to you about. Understand is not directly accessible or demonstrable, which are the 2 things that elements must be. If you wanted to actually test that someone, or you thought it was really important in your unit that they understand basic geometry, you would ask yourself, how will I assess this to see if they understand? And then that's what you would write instead. Also, it's been written in title case, not sentence case, so basic geometry should both be in lowercase if you're writing this. The second one, they're not verbs, so I always call them participles, but I must say that there was on one of my webinars someone who told me that they are gerunds, and I thought, well, I'm not a grammar guru, but if people think they're gerunds, then that's actually fine, no problem at all. But anything ending in ing, you know that you're in the wrong place in terms of your verbs. So this should have just been archive and delete documents as the element, and then the performance criteria would have actually fleshed that out in terms of what you expect to see. The third one would have been fine, except it's got a personal pronoun in there. So it should just be build the business or build a business, depending on the flavour of the rest of the elements and performance criteria. Number 4, that's not an outcome, and it reads very much as if it's a performance criterion. Also, it's got an appropriate level of skill, which again is open to interpretation. And as an element, this would be better just as lead a group discussion. And then it's straightforward. And then some of your performance criteria might beat out on the steps required, in your preparation for actually leading the discussion. And you don't have to have an appropriate level of skill, because as soon as you start writing those performance criteria, you'll be talking about how to actually do it. And that will actually define what you mean by your appropriate level of skill. Number 5, demonstrate awareness of, again, is not directly assessable. And so just simply apply the principles of aeronautics would have been a much more straightforward one. And the last one, undertake a SWOT analysis, meets the template. And you can see here, I've given you one with an acronym, which normally we avoid, but it's such a well-known acronym and so well accepted and so neat that we would like to see it in an element rather than saying undertake a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis, because that's just far too wordy. All right, so the next part of our template, of course, are the performance criteria that link to our elements. And so that's the most important thing, of course, which is the first stop point on your screen. They must be evaluative statements that specify the performance to be assessed and the required level of performance for the element to which they relate. That's the second bit, including a standard of performance up there. We're specifying the performance in roles, tasks and skills. It should reflect applied knowledge where this is required for competent performance, but we don't say demonstrate knowledge. We actually work out what that means in terms of the competency. Try to be as concise as you can in expression. You need to reflect the required complexity of the unit, so requiring someone to actually simply list something, for example, rather than apply it or explain it. If it's a knowledge-based unit, you might be explaining something. If it's in a certificate 4, you're not going to be asking someone in a knowledge-based unit to list something. You're going to have them explain it. In a vocational unit, they'd be applying something. Avoid terminology that's open to interpretation by different assessors. I keep labouring that point because it happens all the time. The number of times I see units of competency that say, do this in an appropriate way with relevant people, and then I'll put in another appropriate bit further along. It's not directly assessable. So also avoid things like recognise, reflect on, consider, anything that happens in your head. Think about what the outcome of that will be, and that's what you're trying to reflect here. You want a measure by which you can actually work out whether someone's met the element. You'll notice also we talk about foundation skills up there as well, and I will mention it here. We'll come back to it when we actually look at the foundation skills section of the template. But foundation skills essential to performance should be in your performance criteria. This idea of having them as a separate table is only used if it's impossible to write them as performance criteria. So very important that if it's important that someone writes a report, it should be a performance criterion against the respective element, rather than making a table and putting it as a separate thing, because, you know, then RTOs have to have all these assessments where they have to address all those foundation skills, which should really have been part and parcel of the unit. So you've got the opportunity, you're writing your units from scratch, you've got the opportunity to do this really well. Performance criteria can be written in either active voice or passive voice, and there are examples of this in the template, in the guidance, so that you know what to do. Active voice is popular because it's straightforward, it's readable, and certainly for anyone with a reading age under 12, passive voice is a little bit difficult. But we try to write our units, of course, in plain English. So if you want to use active voice, do it. Don't forget, though, that you still have to include a standard of performance. And what I'm finding, people write in active voice, they forget about the standard of performance and they just write a list of tasks. So you need to try and avoid that. Also, sometimes people have got their old units in passive voice where they've got the subject first, sorry, the object first. They're saying this is done in a certain way rather than do this in a certain way. And so passive voice, people always wrote the standard of performance because they would say, you know, the report is written in accordance with organisational procedures, there's your standard. And then when they write it in active voice and say write a report, they forget about putting in a standard of performance. And of course, when you write a report, there are all sorts of standards you can put in. You know, you have to address the audience, you have to use either formal or informal language depending on who you're writing the report for, and so on. Also, I've got a note to myself, don't repeat the element. Sometimes people say in the element, write a report, and then in the performance criterion, they say a report is written. That's very circular and wouldn't be accepted by any of our accreditation assessors. Don't use the personal pronouns, same as in the element. Try to avoid overly detailed requirements. So often we'll split things up and we'll have them all as separate criteria. But sometimes, you know, there might be 3 things that actually go together that are all, if you don't do them all together, there's a problem. So it might look like it's overly detailed because it's got 3 things in it, but it's still actually okay. So you make a judgment on this, and we look at what you've done, and if it makes sense because those 3 things go together, then there wouldn't be a comment about it being overly detailed. Avoid simply providing a list of tasks. I've already said that one. And avoid particular products, same as before in the element, rather than a more general description that'll have some longevity over time. And again, write in sentence case. And if you're someone who's transferring things from the old template into the current template, no bold, underlining or italic fonts, because the streamlined version of the template doesn't have a range of conditions, which is what the bold and underlining and italics always referred to. Also, you can't put dot points. So you're not writing something and then saying including and putting a few dot points. Those don't appear in performance criteria, but you'll find that you can actually use them in the knowledge section of the assessment requirements for the units. So let's have a go at an activity. In this activity, you are looking at task 5 in handout 1, and you've got 5 performance criteria there to look at. So you can take say 3 minutes for this one. All right, so let's look at these performance criteria. You notice in the first one, they've used appropriate, of course, which is a real no-no. That's open to interpretation. Who's going to decide what are appropriate levels? And so we don't use it. We explain what those appropriate levels are if we're going to do that. Self-awareness and understanding are 2 things that can't be directly assessed. They almost need their own little set of criteria underneath them, so we know what they're talking about. The second one, it's got a personal pronoun in it, So rather than identify the steps you need to take, you just simply put identify the steps needed to set up a business. The next one, consider. Again, there's something that happens inside your head, so not directly accessible. Consider the impact of COVID-19 on the environment. COVID-19 is very topical, but it does constrain the performance to one virus and one time period, although our time period is getting longer and longer, I know. So something like determine the impact of a human virus pandemic on the environment would be much better. It has a bit more longevity, it's going to last. You could use it if there was a different pandemic at the time that you were teaching this, you'd be able to cover some historic ones from the past, some from the present, and talk about anything in the future. And that's what you want your unit of competency to be like. You want it to reflect what you need it to be for today, but you also need an eye to the future about things that might change. And so if there are things in there that might change, you're better to write them more generally so that the unit of competency will actually last. Number 4, assist clients to access resources that address their needs. This meets the template, and notice that it also has a standard of performance, because if you were just writing this straight, you would say assist clients to access resources. The fact that those resources must address the client's needs puts a performance standard in there that when you're watching someone assist clients to access resources and they're doing it with things that don't address the client's needs, then they wouldn't be competent. They wouldn't be able to demonstrate this. The last one, number 5, hazards are reported appropriately to relevant personnel. Again, open to interpretation, and they don't provide a useful standard of performance. You know, someone's just better to say hazards are reported if they're going to write things like this, because otherwise, you know, we have our assessors trying to work out what's appropriate, and it's up to you as the developer to say what's appropriate, and that's what you would put into your particular performance criterion. Relevant personnel, same, it's open to interpretation. Some people will write things like specified personnel, but at least that points to the fact that probably in a workplace there are specific people that you report your hazards to. Not always the supervisor, but there's often a dedicated person, and that's you know, that's who you would be talking about. And of course, it would vary from organisation to organisation in terms of teaching this. But specified personnel is much better than saying relevant personnel, because who decides who's relevant? Right, on to the next part of our unit of competency template, foundation skills. We don't have any activities on these. There's a description at the top about what it means, and I've noticed that we're getting a new acronym quite often, which is LLND, and apparently the D is now digital literacy that is being bandied around. So I was brought up to speed on that by someone recently who told me not LLNN anymore, LLND. But we've still called it LLN because in the National Information about Foundation Skills, this is the definition. So it says LLN and employment skills essential to performance. That's what they are. Keep in mind, only some foundation skills will occur in a unit of competency. Please don't feel compelled to adjust the work function so that you can include all the foundation skills known to man. It's only those ones that are essential to the performance of the particular work function that are actually going to appear in a unit of competency. And it'll only have some. It's certainly not going to have all of them. So when we talk about LLN, you can see on the screen, we're talking about reading, writing, oral communication, numeracy. And then in the employment skills section is where you'll see technology come up. But if it all changes and we now have a D in with our LLN, then I imagine we'll be talking about digital literacy up there as well, across the board, across all industries. Some of the training packages use the Australian Core Skills Framework, and some of them used to use the Core Skills for Work. And I noticed that business services, which used to use Core Skills for Work, so we had things in there like get the work done. Now they've moved back to the Australian Core Skills Framework, so this is more about the teamwork, problem-solving, initiative, planning and organising, and those ones that are actually listed on the screen there. There is no requirement to use those particular frameworks, and certainly not to use the performance levels from those frameworks. But if you look at the Defence Training Package, you'll see that they've actually put performance variables from the framework and even have the levels in there. I certainly would advise against including levels for these core skills if you intend using them. Everything in a unit of competency must be assessed, and frankly, vocational assessors are not trained to assess the levels. They're for literacy experts. So you'd be setting people up to fail if you actually included levels. So my advice would be don't do it. Just put in the actual foundation skills that you actually want. And again, I'd be going back to my unit. If I find that I want to put teamwork in, I'd be going back to the unit and saying, where's the teamwork in here? And sometimes you find out there's none. It's just quite interesting. The next slide is also foundation skills. So if they're not already explicit in the performance criteria, that's when you might list them in a table, with a brief context statement next to it to say what it actually would mean in the workplace. Including them as performance rather than as separate skills is the way to go. In the performance criteria, that's the way to go. And that way you can then just use the default statement in the template and say foundation skills essential to performance are explicit in the performance criteria of this unit. Definitely don't include them if there is no link to the performance criteria, and certainly don't copy foundation skills table formats from training package units. A lot of the units containing tables, they are already explicit and then they put them again into a table. Don't do that. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of energy for RTOs trying to work out whether they have to assess it separately or try and assess it as part of the unit. And really, foundation skills are not meant to be bolted on. They're meant to be built into the actual work and assessed as part of assessing the work. So much more straightforward if you can include them in your performance criteria rather than trying to add them on at the end. Now in the template, there's a range of conditions, which is an optional field, and is restricted to essential operating conditions and other variables. It's only rarely used in units of competency. Some people have tried to be tricky and keep their previous range statements, which always said may include this and may include that. All of those were in training package land were meant to be moved into the training package companion volumes, but a few training package developers have got quite tricky. And so they say, well, yes, we've written something mandatory because it says you must do one of the following 27 things. Please don't do that. Again, it's a waste for people trying to actually set up assessments. The example on the screen actually is about bus driving. And it's important in bus driving that you don't just drive around a few streets and then get your licence. First get the unit of competency and then get the licence. So the driving conditions here, driving conditions must include metropolitan and non-metro roads, day and night, gravel roads and wet conditions. And that's because the bus driving unit of competency is for tour buses as well as people just driving around in a heavy rigid vehicle in Perth or whatever capital city you happen to be in. When it is included, Of course, it is mandatory and must be assessed. But I can say that in terms of our accredited units coming in, we don't see this used at all. And then the last field that we have to actually worry about in our unit of competency proper, if you like, as opposed to the assessment requirements, is this field, which is mandatory. And this table, of course, says whether there's a previous unit and whether or not it's equivalent. And there are two possible formats for this, and people have their favourite. Some people like the first one because it does tell you the current version versus the old version and whether it's equivalent. Very straightforward. But you can use the second one in the same way. If it was equivalent, you would say this unit supersedes and is or is not equivalent to, and then you'd put the code of the previous unit as well, so that it's straightforward. So we're maybe running a little bit early, but this is the point at which we're going to take a 10-minute break, comfort break, so you can make a cup of tea or whatever, and then and we'll be back here at 20 past 11. Is that right? Yes, 20 past 11. So 11:20. We'll see you back online. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're up to the second half now of the unit of competency template. This is the assessment requirements section, where we had our performance evidence, our knowledge evidence, and our assessment conditions. And we're going to go through, first of all, the performance evidence. The activities that go with this section are all going to be in Handout 2. So we finished up with Handout 1 in the previous slide, and now all the activities will actually be in Handout 2. So elements, performance criteria, foundation skills, range of conditions, everything in the unit of competency that we've just looked at must have already been assessed. So this section does not simply repeat them, although there must be a direct relationship between the performance evidence and the unit of competency. This is an opportunity for you to specify how much evidence, how often you need to see it, and so on. So it could be product evidence. So someone might have to actually produce something, they might have to build something or write something or present something, or it could be process, and they might actually have to demonstrate doing something in front of you. So they might be making a presentation, or they might be, dancing or whatever. And so it's an opportunity to say how much evidence you want and how often you expect to see it. And not every unit of competency on training.gov does this, but some of the better ones actually do it. You don't always have to do things multiple times, but under the principles assessment and the rules of evidence, doing something once is usually not sufficient unless it's a very big project with lots and lots of bits and pieces in it, in which case, one project that takes someone a year to do is certainly, you don't want them to have to do 2 of those. But mostly you want to see something more than once. Some of those units of competency that used to say, if we don't specify a volume, then you have to do it at least once. That's disappeared now out of all of the business services ones, because really, if people had only done things once, they would not have, as an RTO, they wouldn't have been able to meet the principal assessment and rules of evidence under 1.8 in those standards. Because performance criteria because the performance evidence must have a direct relationship with the elements and performance criteria, it also means that nothing new can be introduced into here that was not in the unit. Sometimes people get to here and they suddenly say, oh yes, and we want them to be able to use a computer and do A, B, C and D, and I look back at the unit and I go, that's not actually in the unit. Or they'll suddenly put in that they want teamwork, but the whole unit has been about an individual doing something on their own. So make sure that whatever you come up with, you go back and forth to what you've said in your performance criteria. And look, you might think to yourself, gosh, I should have put technology in here because we always do this using technology. You can put it in, go back to the unit and make sure the unit also requires it so that you get a nice match between the two. It's certainly an opportunity for you to be very specific about what you want. But certainly, I saw a training package unit the other day, and it was more general than the actual unit of competency, which was quite specific, and then all of a sudden it got very general and it just wanted good communication skills and something or other else. And so that's a no-no for us. We want to know exactly what you want to see in terms of the performance evidence for this particular unit of competency. Also, just be careful of the lead-in statements that you use when you're writing these, because again, don't copy training packages, make up your own and keep it simple. Sometimes people have said they want to see someone demonstrate the ability to do something, but be careful of saying that, because you can demonstrate the ability to do something by doing something else. And I've actually had an RTO tell me that they didn't need to assess this particular unit because it only required someone to show that they had the ability, and they had showed him the ability by the other unit that they had already achieved. So you be straightforward. You want to see them do something, just say that. Not that I want to see them evidence of the demonstration of the ability to do something. Just say you want them to actually do it. Much more straightforward. If you want to include a requirement to meet the dimensions of competency, which some training package units do, they must be in the actual unit. As again, otherwise, if you do an assessment, then it becomes invalid because you're assessing something that's not in the unit. So if the particular unit of competency, you can see that you've got task skills, task management skills, contingency management and job role environment skills, sure, put them into your performance evidence as well. But don't just write a throwaway at the beginning that says and must meet the dimensions of competency unless you know that they are all actually in your unit. This is also the section where you set the boundaries for the required performance. So you're needing to write specific, well-defined tasks that are confined to the unit and not broad skill statements, which, as I said, things like, communication skills, or even worse, sound communication skills, whatever that means. And although this sounds silly, please don't put knowledge in this section. This is about performance. And we've got a little task to do on this one. And again, the same deal as before. Just go through and highlight or put question marks on something or circle it or whatever. And we've actually got 8 of these. So you probably need, say, 3 minutes to do it. I usually give you 4, but I've been cutting down today. So if you're finding that the time is not enough, you probably need to let Claire know, and she'll speak severely to me about not giving you enough time. But we have 8 of these performance evidence requirements. One about the difference between good and evil, the next one about preparing a request for tender, using software applications, facilitating meetings, contract law, people's own behaviour, professional practice, applicable standards, and preparing a flow chart. So if you just take, say, 3 minutes to have a look through, and then we'll be back to talk about it. Okay, we're back. So we've had a lead-in statement in this one, which obviously says what you have to do in terms of it probably said you must demonstrate that you've met all the requirements of the elements performance criteria and so on. And then it goes on with the person must also. And the first one, of course, is an example of exactly what not to do. So it's got some understand, which is not directly accessible. It's got good and evil, which are broad concepts, not well defined, and may not even be confined to or specific to the particular unit. They're probably something that runs across a whole lot of units. So avoid statements like this at all costs. The second one meets the template. Prepare a response to at least one request for tender. It's leaving it open for RTOs if they actually want to do it more than once, but keeping in mind that the elements and performance criteria have already been assessed, so all of the processes, the steps that people would have taken to put together a request for tender have already been assessed. And so this is like the capstone event where you get them to prepare at least one request for tender from woe to go, and then you assessing that. Use appropriate software applications. Again, appropriate's open to interpretation. Software applications is very broad. It's not confined to at least the type of application. And we often find that this requirement has no direct relationship with the unit because they've just added it at this point. Suddenly thought, oh yes, we have to be able to use technology, so they've thrown that in as well without going back to the unit and seeing that in fact there's no technology being used in the unit. Number 4, facilitate at least 2 management meetings. In a management unit of competency, this meets the template. It's very concise, it's straightforward, everyone knows what it means, and the unit will tell you what you expect to see the person doing in those management meetings. So this is just capturing the performance evidence requirement on top of what is already being assessed in the unit. The next one, demonstrate an in-depth understanding of contract law. It's actually a knowledge requirement and not not performance, and not directly accessible. And I think it probably came from when I think it was business services, in their knowledge section they always put verbs in it, which was a bit silly at the time. But anyway, demonstrating that you know about contract law is certainly a knowledge component and should be down in the knowledge evidence requirements. The next one, apply insight to their own behaviour in relation to their professional practice. Writing it, it's not directly accessible anyway. Apply insight. And of course we would get rid of all of those personal pronouns because they're just not needed. So, you know, do something with your own behaviour in relation to professional practice. But I would suggest that that wouldn't work at all, and that you'd need something totally different if you actually wanted to see that they're reflecting on their own practice in order to improve it. And you'd be better to say that you wanted evidence of improvement in their practice, whatever that means. But again, it depends on what you've got in the unit. In number 8, of course, applicable, apply applicable standards. So open to interpretation, so we don't do it and we say what standards there are. And if we've referred to the standards already in the unit, or we identify them down in the knowledge evidence requirements, then you just want them applied. And I would hope that we would be saying what we were going to actually apply them to, rather than simply apply something. And then the 9th one there, prepare a flow chart, meets the template. And again, keeping in mind that the whole unit is being assessed anyway. And then you want a flow chart so that you can see that someone actually knows the order that they have to actually do things in, from initiating their project to closing it out once it's actually finished. Sorry about the numbering there, because that number 1 shouldn't be there on the person must also, and that's an interesting little comma that's crept its way in as well. Okay, so the next section, of course, is the knowledge evidence section, where we specify what they need to know. Again, it will relate directly to the performance criteria and the range of conditions if that's present in the unit. Again, we don't want broad areas of knowledge. We want you to put some boundaries around it so that it's actually confined to the unit. An example of this that training.gov is that in some of the early childhood education units, everyone has to know about the early years learning framework. And so that framework has been written into every unit. If you're doing this, you would pick the parts of the framework that were relevant, and that's the knowledge you would test in this unit. You wouldn't put the whole framework into every single unit. You'd go, okay, this is a big framework. Section 3 is what they need to know to do this particular unit of competency. I'll only test that they need knowledge of that particular one, rather than, you know, this broad statement about everything. It's like saying you need to know your legislation, and then you don't actually confine it to what the unit is about. So we wouldn't expect knowledge to be the same across all the units, because every unit really is unique. It's focusing on a particular area. So keep the context of your knowledge confined to that area as well. If you can indicate the type and depth of knowledge required to meet the demands of the unit of competency, that's certainly very good if that's possible for you to do. And don't include performance in this section. In the knowledge section, we do quite often have sub-dot points, if you like, because it'll say you have to demonstrate knowledge of, and have this list. And in the list, they might actually put such as and put some very specific things, and that's the way they write it, to confine it to the unit of competencies context. It just gives a bit more context and a bit more information, and that's certainly fine. You don't do it in the performance criteria in the unit itself, but you can certainly do it in your knowledge evidence section. Keeping in mind too that everything is compulsory in this, so it's not, oh, it may include the following, which sounds like a range statement, but you can say knowledge of this, including, and then put some dot points underneath. That certainly makes it very clear then for the reader. So let's have a go at the activity for this section. And again, I think we've got about 8 of these to look at. So you'll need, say, 3 minutes again to actually look through them. There's one on the Old Testament, one on workplace change, one on targets and measures for quality, one on doing some research. There's a professional development one, contraindications for treatment, one on legislation and regs, and one on developmental milestones. So I'll see you back in 3 minutes. Okay, so I know you all expected the Old Testament to be in red here. You notice the lead-in statement: to achieve competency in this unit, a person must demonstrate knowledge of. So very concise. It doesn't rattle on about the fact that the knowledge is to assess what's in the elements and performance criteria. It doesn't say any of that. It just simply says, if you want to achieve competency, this is the knowledge that must be tested. So Old Testament, far too broad a statement. 39 books in the Old Testament, so we'd want to actually hone in on what it is that needs to be tested. Is it in-depth testing? Is it a general overview? What is it? So it's far too imprecise to be of use as a knowledge evidence requirement. The second one, I've highlighted typical problems, but depending on what's in the unit, it might be okay. If the unit itself doesn't deal with any typical problems, then it might be actually open to interpretation. So horses for courses, it depends what's in the rest of the unit, that one. In the third one, knowledge of targets and associated measures for output and quality. And it's always a good idea to keep saying to yourself knowledge of at the beginning of these when you're writing them. So knowledge of typical problems, yeah, the grammar works. Knowledge of targets and associated measures, yes, the grammar works there as well. So the next one, research and document intervention strategies. Now we've got verbs coming in here, and so these are probably performance evidence requirements and should be up in the performance evidence, so not here. The fifth one, knowledge of professional development. Too broad, far too broad, and you wonder if that's what was actually meant, or did it mean that they had to do professional development and not just have knowledge of it. The next one, of course, awareness is not directly assessable, but also it doesn't work flowing from this top stem. So demonstrate knowledge of awareness of. You only have to have knowledge of your awareness of contraindications. So it should simply say knowledge of contraindications for the treatment, keeping it simple and concise. The next one, again, relevant. Open to interpretation, who decides what's relevant. Knowledge of the developmental milestones for children 0 to 5 years of age, yes, very specific, and probably the unit was talking about working with children according to their developmental milestone, and here's the opportunity for people to actually learn the knowledge that sits underneath that particular performance. So number 8 definitely meets the template requirements. So on to the next section of the template, which is the assessment conditions. And you'll notice up there, mandatory conditions only in this section. So we don't include assessment strategies, assessment methods, assessment tools, unless it's mandatory that they are to be used. And usually what we're saying is, well, you have to remind yourself that what we're saying here is, what are the conditions under which I must do this assessment of my students? That's what I'm trying to actually capture in this section. So I'm not waffling on about the sorts of methods and tools and so on that you may be able to use, and people still do it. They still write, oh yes, assessment tools may include, and they'll give you a list. But remembering you're also writing a course document when you're developing these units of competency. And so anything that's in here will be reflected in the course document. And if you want to talk about how things like the methods of assessment, you can do that over in the course document. You don't actually put it in here and constrain this unit to having to do a particular method, for example. So don't include redundant information that's already mandated in the standards for RTOs. So there is a section at the bottom of this assessment conditions where you actually say what the assessor requirements are. If it's already in the standards for RTOs, just say they have to meet the standards for RTOs, the assessors do, rather than actually wasting time writing it all out. Assessment-related items in this section, of course, must be consistent with whatever you put in your course document, and the same with the assessor requirements. So you can actually go over and above what's in the standards for RTOs, and if you are doing that, for example, someone who does a diploma of counselling probably can't teach it because it's usually taught by a registered counsellor. So if you're saying things like that, and the same with literacy, so someone who does a certificate 2 in something can't actually teach other people to improve their literacy. So it's fine to actually say that someone has to have a certain level of qualification or a certain level of experience, but in the course document, you are asked to actually justify that. And of course, on the slide, it says, of course, you can say unacceptable assessment methods. So if you say, for example, you might have your course being a blended delivery. Some of it's been delivered online, but you might want to make a rule that no one who delivers your course actually assesses it online. You might want assessment to be face-to-face, actually seeing the student. And if that's the case, you would put into these units that wasn't acceptable. And the example up there about using a simulator, that's actually taken from a training package unit, which tells you that, if you're assessing someone driving a haul truck, you can't just assess them sitting in the simulator, no matter how much the simulator shakes the seat to make you feel like you're in a real haul truck. It's not acceptable. You have to actually be in a real haul truck when you're being assessed against the unit. The template has a suggested default statement in it, so that it has some longevity, and so it will suggest that you use assessors must satisfy the assessor requirements in the standards for RTOs current at the time of assessment. And this is just because we've had our standards since 2015 and they're looking at them again at the moment. And so if we put 2015 into our unit, we have to go back and change it. So we're trying to write something a little bit more general, and you'll see this coming out in some of the current units of competency. People, I think, writing the training package units are realising that things might change in the near future. And so they're also writing much more generic statements, so that their units won't have to be amended in the near future. So let's have a look at our next activity, which is task 3 in our second handout. And again, you're just looking through the conditions and asking yourself, is this okay or not? And just highlight or circle or whatever, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. We've got one about assessment in the workplace. We've got one about observation and questioning. We've got one about classifying samples. The fourth one is about access to materials, tools and equipment. The fifth one is about co-assessment, and the last one is about assessor experience. So you probably only need a couple of minutes for this one, so I'll see you back in 2 minutes. Okay, so we're back again. The first one, you'll see we haven't got any red on that one. So assessment must occur, so it's mandatory, in a workplace or a simulated workplace that replicates workplace conditions. So that's perfectly fine. In the second one, should be, there's always arguments about should be. Some people say it means must, and some people say, oh no, it should be done like that, but it doesn't have to be. So we don't use it. If it must happen, we use the word must, so it's very clear. Observation and questioning are actually assessment methods. They're not really the conditions under which assessments must occur, so you probably wouldn't use those in here. In the third one, assessment must include achievement of classifying samples. This is a performance requirement and not a condition of assessment, so it's just in the wrong place. And so you would write it up in your performance evidence requirements rather than saying it's a condition for everyone undertaking assessment. The fourth one, which is a requirement, is definitely a condition for assessment, so that one's a good one. Students must have access to materials, tools and equipment, including the PPE that's required, because the unit happens to be a tool setting unit, and so they definitely need their protective equipment. The fifth one is a may straight away, so you knock it out because it's got maybe. It's also got co-assessed, and if they must be assessed together, so it's got maybe and it's got co-assessed rather than must and co-requisites, which is really what you would have if you had a must. So if they must be assessed together, they would be co-requisites. You would still include them in this section, but it would be written differently. It would say this unit must be assessed with this unit because it's co-requisite, or you'd simply say this unit has a co-requisite, and you would list what that was, so that they would then be delivered and assessed together. And then the last one, this is having said that your assessors must meet the standards for RTOs in terms of assessors. This goes on to say, in addition, assessors must have a minimum of 5 years industry experience in whatever the work is for it. So, you know, sometimes it's in early childhood education or in management or whatever it happens to be. And of course, that's fine for here, but then when you go back to your course document and you're filling that in terms of the requirements for assessors, the course document asks you to justify anything that's over and above the requirements and the standards for RTOs. So then you have to put a justification in for that. And usually that's not a problem for people, because there's a good reason to require a level of experience or a higher level of qualification as well. Okay. Now this is the final steps for you to put everything together, and this particular slide is not telling you the order in which to do it, other than you repeat the development process for each unit of competency. And if I was doing it, I would probably go down to determining the core and elective units next, rather than doing the AQF at this point. But these are just the tasks that have to be done after you've written your individual units of competency. So we'll go through them in terms of the order that they're written up there, but probably you would do them in a slightly different order from what's actually on the screen. So the first one is about determining the AQF, and some people write their units with an AQF in mind. They think they're going to write an advanced diploma, but when they get to this point in time, if they've reflected the work, honestly reflected the work, listened to the industry, and actually written the units of competency to reflect the work functions, now's the time that you have to actually look at all the units that you've got, the outcomes from all the units, and work out whether or not that does actually meet the AQF at the level that you think it does. When you're putting together the course document, you will be asked to provide examples of how it meets the AQF, not just, oh yes, trust me, it does meet the AQF, it is an advanced diploma. We want to see examples of how it does. And the best way to do that is to quote some of the things from your units. But remember, you're looking across the outcomes of all the units to meet the AQF. Not one and not all of them have to actually meet the AQF. So you would go to the AQF itself, and you would look, make sure you're in the second edition, which I think was 2013 it came out, and have a look at the level summaries, because there are summaries for the AQF levels and some learning criteria. Probably the best ones for the advanced diploma would be to look in the skills section, which tells you that your students have to have a range of cognitive, technical and communication skills. They have to be able to select and apply particular methods and technologies. They have to analyse information to complete a range of activities. They interpret and transmit solutions to unpredictable and sometimes complex problems. So you're looking for examples of these things across all of your units, and make a note of them, because you will need them when you put together your course document. And of course, they have to transmit information and skills to others, and that's the skill requirements. And then down in the application of their skills requirement, it talks about the fact that they'll be demonstrating autonomy and judgment, and they'll have responsibility in contexts that are subject to change. There'll be broad parameters to provide specialist advice and functions. So that's one area that you would go to. The second area in the AQF that's useful is, of course, the AQF qualification type for an advanced diploma. And again, there's a list of skills there, and some of them are just slightly different, because they'll talk about formulating responses to complex problems, having wide-ranging, specialised technical creative or conceptual skills, and depth in your specialisation, contexts that are subject to change, initiative and judgment. You're doing some planning, design, technical or management functions, and so on. So that's the sort of thing you're looking for in your units, and you make a note of those. And as long as you've got, you can find some of these in the majority of your units, then you'll be able to say that it meets the AQF. Not every unit, because units individually don't meet the AQF, they don't have the breadth and depth. So across all of them, though, you might find you've got some that have nothing. And you may very well have put your qualification together in such a way that you're going to scaffold the learning for your students. So you're going to give them an easy intro unit, and then it's going to lead to the more complex unit. And this is educationally sound, and we do it all the time. That particular unit is not actually contributing any complexity to your advanced diploma, but it's perfectly fine to have it in there. Sometimes people are putting together something that ends up as a certificate 4, and it's got one higher level unit in it, which probably, if it was in a different combination, might have ended up in a diploma. So again, that's perfectly fine, because in the workplace we do not do all of our tasks at one homogeneous level. We do some at lower levels and some at higher levels, but the vast majority should line up to a particular level in the, or particular qualification in the AQF. Now, as we're going through, we also have to assign nominal hours to our individual units. And again, this is a requirement not of the unit of competency template, but it's a requirement of the accredited course document when you get to actually filling that in. So you do have to assign those nominal hours to each unit, and you put them in a table in the course document. And it's the time it would take to train someone with no prior knowledge. So we're talking about the structured training, and if it's face-to-face, the supervised training, if you like. You also consider the period over which the course would be provided, whether it's going to be provided over 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 6 months, how many weeks in total. Think about what time commitment per week you would expect students to make in their own time, because this total is also needed in terms of the additional non-structured, non-supervised time that students will need to spend. And RTOs always tell students to expect to do things in their own time. So when we're writing accredited courses, in the course document, you'll actually say something about this. You need to, we're down now onto the core and elective. If you haven't already done it, you have to consult to determine which of your units would apply to everyone. They become the core units in your qualification, and then you might have some electives that you have to actually choose from, or you might do like a training package and let people choose a couple of units from elsewhere. What tends to happen in our accredited courses is that because you're writing for a specific need, people don't go outside that need, and so they may very well put together a course which is core only. In other words, every unit, even if there are 12 of them, are all mandatory. They're all core. There are no ifs, buts and maybes. There's no electives elsewhere, because they're focused on meeting a particular need of the industry that they're in, or a particular community need that they're trying to address that's not addressed by training packages. So they're not trying to write a general training package qualification that helps students go in many different directions afterwards. It's very specific and very focused on a niche area or a gap in the market that we're trying to fill with our units of competency that we're writing ourselves. So that's fine as well. You know, it's much less likely that you would have a qualification that was made up all of electives. But training packages can do this, but very unlikely in the accreditation space. Much more likely that you would have core only. So now you also have to work out the volume of learning. But if you've assigned a nominal hours for each unit, and you've thought about how much time students will spend in their own time, then all you need to do is add those together, and that will give you your volume of learning. And this should align to whatever you've put in the course duration in section 4.2 of the course document. So back and forth, once you've actually finished these units and are putting them together, you are usually writing the course document at this point, and so you make sure that whatever you've said here actually lines up with the course document. So volume of learning actually is written in, I think it's written in 4.1 here, it's probably 4.2, but anyway, we'll cover that next week when we're looking at the process for putting together an accredited course from scratch. But you need, once you've got your number of hours, you need to then compare that with the typical volume of learning for the AQF, which is actually again in the AQF documents. There will be a volume of learning, I think it's in the qualification type descriptor area. And so, for example, for my advanced diploma, I would look there and it would tell me that the volume of learning in an advanced diploma is typically 1.5 to 2 years. And we've done ours in hours, but there's also a handout for AQF on their website, which tells you that the typical hours for an academic year is 1,200, and we use that as a ballpark figure. We're certainly not wedded to having exactly 1,200 hours, but if you've done an advanced diploma, which is meant to be 1.5 or to 2, it was typically 1.5 to 2 years, then you're looking at 1,800 to 2,400 hours. And if you've got 200 hours, you might have to think again, because that's way different from the hours that are specified here. And it's not that it's wrong, it's just that you have to justify why your particular hours are so few compared with what is typical for the particular AQF that you're aiming for here. So again, in the course document, you would have to justify it. And if your particular qualification is for people who are highly experienced, and this is adding a specialisation on top of what they already have, then it may be fine, but it still has to have the breadth and depth required of the AQF level. And it probably means that you would find, if you look down the skill and knowledge and application areas in the AQF, there might be some things missing, in which case it could end up being a short course rather than a full qualification, because it must have breadth and depth, not just depth. And so if you haven't got enough breadth, it may end up being that it's a short course. And it would then be course in, and it would have the units of competency, and you would get a statement, issue a statement of attainment, or the RTO with it on scope would issue a statement of attainment for it. And I've had one of these in the past where, when I wrote up the report, I said the choices here are to add more breadth and depth to this to make it a full qualification, or to change it into a course in. And the owner of the course actually went back and added in a whole lot of things which ended up being available anyway. He'd already developed them, but he was trying to hone in on the specific things that he wanted to cover. And as I said to them at the time, some people will still only do a statement of attainment. They won't want all those extras, and that's fine, because it doesn't matter whether you've made it a full qual or a course in. If someone does part of a course, they will end up with their statement of attainment for it anyway, which is what they would also get if it was a short course. Okay, so we've done well. I was wondering if we could do this in a couple of hours rather than go all the way to 1 o'clock. And so I've met my requirement, which was to only give you 2 or 3 minutes instead of 4 or 5 minutes on the way through. And I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback. We've got one question, excuse me, We've got one question in terms of whether or not there are a minimum number of units required to make up a qualification, and there are no rules around that at all, and you're making these rules in your particular qualification. So, you know, if people have a small number of units, those units tend to be larger. So if you had only half a dozen units, you might find every one of those units was 100 hours. And that's acceptable. That happens in training packages. You know, sometimes we have a qualification where some units are 20 units, 20 hours, some are 40 hours, some are 100 hours. And then there are other qualifications where I've even seen 120 hours for a particular unit of competency. So no, there's no rule, but when you put your course document in, you'll be explaining how these things occur, and then if you make a good case for it, then of course it will be accepted, because there is a huge range in the training packages, and we also have that same sort of range across our accredited units as well. Yeah, okay, thanks, Amy. So if there are no more questions, you can, if you think of some later, you can always email in. We'll put up the email here, and probably email is better, because if you try to actually ring, you know, people work different hours and different days in TAC. It's a wonderful workplace, and so always better, I think, to actually email in to TAC course accreditation, and that way it'll be dealt with by the correct person, and they'll get back to you straight away. Just a reminder too that we always ask you for feedback on the session, how you think it can be improved. If you found that it was too fast and that you actually needed more time for your activities, then we might go back to using our full 3 hours, but we tend to go just over the 2 hours. So, you know, maybe we'll say it's 2.5 in future instead of 3. But thank you for your participation today. We hope that you found it very useful.